Ah, yes. NATO, which is supposed to be the strongest military alliance in the world. But what happens when its biggest member starts pulling in the opposite direction? So currently, there are serious cracks that are forming between the United States and Europe over where NATO should be headed. From strategic disagreements over Greenland to clashing views on how to end the war in Ukraine. And even deeper debates over NATO's future. These divisions aren't just small policy differences. Oh no, they could change the entire balance of power within the alliance itself. So is NATO starting to break apart? Or is it just usual tensions between allies that get smoothed over in the end? Well, we'll find out. And while Ukraine is the biggest issue currently grabbing the headlines as I'm talking to you all, the cracks in NATO are showing up in other places as well, like Greenland. Now, you might not hear much about it, but behind the scenes, the United States and Europe have been quietly clashing over control, resources, and military influence in the Arctic area. And this isn't just about Greenland itself. No, it's about who really calls the shots in NATO when strategic interests collide between members. So let's get into it. The first point, US versus Europe on Greenland, a strategic tug of war. At first glance, Greenland might not seem like a major geopolitical flashpoint, but it's actually a growing source of tension between the United States and Europe. Washington sees Greenland as a critical strategic asset, both for its Arctic positioning and its untapped natural resources. The US has been pushing for stronger presence and even floating the idea of outright purchasing it under Trump, which Denmark and the EU outright rejects. More recently, America's efforts to secure mining rights and expand military operations there have sparked concerns in Europe over sovereignty and economic control. To European leaders, this feels like another instance of Washington trying to dominate a region that doesn't belong to them. But from the American side, this is about staying ahead of China and, yes, even Russia, both of whom are eyeing the Arctic's strategic value. The real question is, will Europe push back hard enough to keep the United States in check, or will America's security concerns ultimately override those objections? If NATO can't even agree on who controls key strategic regions within its own sphere, how will it manage more complex global challenges? This Greenland issue may seem small for now, but it's part of a bigger trend of growing friction between Washington and its European allies. So as you can see here, European leaders and European countries, especially Denmark, are definitely overreacting over here. It's pretty clear they were caught off guard by their own protector, that being America. They have their own plans for taking something from their NATO allies, and now they're the ones on the receiving end, with the US setting its sights on Greenland. I find this really ironic. They assumed it would be Russia or China pulling moves like this. But once again, and I say this very objectively here, they always miscalculate on their judgment. With a new administration, the United States is acting like the very countries that these European countries all fear. Greenland's importance to America far outweighs Denmark's hold over it. Trump sees its untapped resources and control over the Arctic as way more valuable than keeping up NATO's outdated structure. And like I said in the older videos that I have released, the United States already has a base there. So you could argue it's basically American territory already. Now, European NATO members might not like it, but at the end of the day, they're basically vassal states under US protection, no doubt. They can argue, they can be mad, but America is the one that actually calls the shots here. Trump even straight up called Denmark's prime minister and basically tried to negotiate a deal to buy Greenland, and well, she refused, which isn't surprising. So what did Trump do? He basically threatened to hit all of Europe with tariffs if he didn't get what he wanted, which is smart in terms of negotiating on his art of the deal mentality and persuasion. With that all being said, the cracks in NATO are becoming ever more so clear. America's foreign policy is overriding Europe's own security concerns, as the current administration cuts military spending overseas and shifts focus to its own home front. Greenland is just basically one example of how NATO allies are truly struggling to align their interests here. But the deeper divide is happening over much bigger issues, which is Ukraine. While Greenland's disputes are about long-term strategic positioning, the war in Ukraine is a crisis happening in real time, and the United States and Europe are starting to clash over how to bring that conflict to an end. Number 2, NATO divided. Ukraine peace deal dilemma. Ukraine has become a major sticking point within NATO, not just because of the war itself, but because of growing disagreement on how to end it. The United States facing domestic political pressure at home and concerns over military aid limitations, is increasingly open to exploring negotiated peace with Russia. Meanwhile, many European nations, especially in Eastern Europe, sees this as a massive mistake. From their perspective, any peace deal that leaves Russia in control of occupied Ukrainian territory only encourages future aggression. Problem is what Washington and European capitals have fundamentally different endgames here. The United States is looking at this from a broader strategic level, balancing its military focus between Europe and China, whereas Europe, particularly countries like Poland and the Baltics, see Russian aggression as an existential threat. If the United States pushes for negotiations while Europe resists, NATO could find itself in one of the deepest internal conflicts yet. And if Washington moves forward with the peace plan unilaterally, it could trigger a crisis of confidence within the alliance, making NATO look fractured at a time when unity is more crucial than ever. This raises the question, if America and Europe can't agree on Ukraine, what other geopolitical flashpoints could further drive them apart? I think America re-establishing diplomacy with Russia is the right move here, for those who are sane, at least. But for many European countries, they see this as a betrayal, given how much more they've invested in this conflict compared to the United States. Trump has even pointed out that while America has sent most of its military equipment, Europe isn't paying its fair share to NATO, which he is absolutely 100% correct here. Instead, they're directly funding Ukraine, which isn't exactly the same. Yes, they're sending some military aid, but nothing close to what the United States has actually been providing. This sudden shift is shocking NATO members like Britain, Germany, France, and yes, the Baltic states as well. They've even had their small kids meeting in France this week to discuss sending their own peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. Good luck with that. Just ask the French and the Germans how that went. That concept has also pushed EU Commission President Ursula to suggest creating a united European army to counter Russia or any other threat for that matter. But that would come with massive issues. Cost alone would strain their budgets, affecting social security, healthcare, and everything else. Not to mention the challenge of mass-producing military equipment and properly training troops. Well, if they're even loyal or even willing to fight Russia in the first place. Lastly, I would say for this point that yes, the European politicians are acting like children. Honestly, it's quite sad and pathetic if you ask me. They should be focusing on trying to establish peace through actually talking with Russia, rather than throwing baby tantrums because America did it first rather than them. That's all I gotta say for that though. The disagreement over Ukraine isn't just about one war. It reflects a much larger problem within NATO itself. The alliance is facing an identity crisis, with the United States pushing for a more global strategy, while Europe wants to keep its focus closer to home. This fundamental split over NATO's purpose is leading to deeper cracks in the alliance's long-term future. Number 3. The future of NATO, a transatlantic power struggle. The core issue dividing NATO right now isn't just about Russia or Ukraine. It's about the alliance's overall direction. The United States wants NATO to pivot toward countering China, expanding its influence in the Indo-Pacific, and reinforcing global deterrence. But European countries, especially France and Germany, aren't on board with this kind of shift. They argue that NATO was built to defend Europe, not to become a global policing force for the United States' strategic interests. On top of that, there's growing frustration in Europe over the imbalance in defense spending, with the United States shouldering much of NATO's military burden, while some European countries still lag behind in their commitments. The bigger question is whether NATO will remain a unified force, or if this growing rifts will push Europe toward greater defense independence. If that happens, NATO as we know it could start looking very different in the next decade. Could this lead to European-led military blocs separate from NATO, or will American influence remain dominant? Either way, the cracks in the alliance are becoming harder to ignore, and how NATO navigates these internal struggles will shape its role in the next global conflict. This unity seems to be getting worse by the day if you all haven't noticed. I don't really see NATO lasting much longer as it clashes with Trump's American first foreign policy. Because Trump is more focused on China than Ukraine, and he really has no interest in Europe's defense. He knows they can defend themselves, just not to the level that America can, of course. European leaders prioritizing their own security is fine and all, but if they won't contribute equally to NATO, why should Americans keep footing the bill? It's a serious question. That right there, folks, is one of Trump's key arguments, and a major reason NATO is currently fracturing. Now, if it collapses, which seems more likely than ever, European stability will be in question. Countries could start pushing back against Western dominance, something that's been in place for about over 30 years or so. What I mean by this is that we'll likely see old regional conflicts reignite, much like Ukraine and Russia are currently, except without NATO intervention. It would be a smaller scale version of Ukraine's war, bringing Europe back to a regional alliance system, similar to what led to World War I. In simple terms, we're seeing a realignment of power that's been missing since the Soviet Union's collapse, to put it simply. So for my final thoughts here on all of this, NATO stability in Europe is objectively and honestly, from what we can see, falling apart, to put it very much so politely. Zelensky is strangely biting the hand that is feeding him, that being America, of course, which only hurts the case for NATO intervention and or Ukraine joining at all into NATO. This is pushing European countries to consider forming their own security alliance without the United States being present or even in it, which I'm curious to see if they even will and or if that will even be successful at all, which I highly doubt, but we shall see. Meanwhile, most European nations are still going to be backing Ukraine to the bitter end, which is honestly unfortunate. And with the world shifting toward a more multipolar order, we may be seeing both the end of the Ukraine war and the rise of a new global security structure, which is something worth paying attention to in my opinion, to see how things will actually evolve. I'm gonna go on a limb and say we're gonna see more regional conflicts in Europe, primarily in places like Eastern Europe, and who knows, maybe even in Western Europe, though I highly doubt it because they're more docile and more easily controllable, to put it lightly. Eastern Europe, no, as we're currently seeing. So guys, if you really like this video, obviously stay tuned for the next one. And yeah, that's about it. I will see you in the next video. Peace.